Hi, it's Mrs. Tyler. Today we're doing Unit 3, Notes 5, Civil War and Reconstruction. This is North versus the South, Strengths and Weaknesses. These are the 2 pages in our notes packet we are going to complete, 11 and 12. All right, we took a look at this photograph. We talked a little bit about how this is the first war that we actually have photography going on, and so that's going to impact the way that people feel and see and experience the war. When the Confederate soldiers fired on U.S. troops stationed at Fort Sumter in South Carolina in April of 1861, both sides knew a war had begun. Both sides were confident, though, that their side would quickly be victorious. Most Americans, whether they were from the North or South, assumed that the war would last basically 90 days, 3 months, and that's that. After the first Battle of Bull Run, both the Union and Confederate armies realized the war would be much longer and far more devastating than they anticipated. And as more and more battles are fought, these strengths and weaknesses of both of these armies became more obvious. So today we did a graham cracker and frosting challenge as teams, and we had specific rules that impacted the way that we could play this game. I'm going to skip all of that because we don't need to do that. We're not in the classroom to take part in this for this moment. So we'll skip ahead to the part where we actually filled in our notes packet. All right. So for population for the North, the Union Army had the Union had 22 million people overall, 4 million men ages 15 to 40. I'm going to give them a rank of 3 points for that. That's a definite strength. They have far more than double the amount of eligible fighting men and population overall. The South is going to have 9 million people, 1.2 million of them white men ages 15 to 40. I'm going to give them a 1. Okay, in terms of leadership, the United States, the U.S., the North had Abraham Lincoln as its leader. He acted with confidence. He prevented border states from seceding. He had a talent for managing men. So I gave him 3 points. For the South, we have Jefferson Davis, who did not have Lincoln's energy and authority. He struggled to get the full support of all 11 Confederate states, keeping in mind that the Confederacy chose him as leader because he wasn't a very aggressive and bossy person, because this is a group of 11 states that are very rebellious. They don't really want to be bossed around. They don't want a very strong central government. It's basically the reason why they're leaving the Union. So their choice, though, is going to come back to bite them because Jefferson Davis just doesn't really have the authority to pull everybody together the way he needs to. So for food production, the North had access to 65% of the nation's farmland, and they could keep citizens and soldiers better fed. They're growing corn and the hearty wheat from here in Minnesota. That's going to help keep their soldiers and their citizens from being hungry. In the South, they have access to 35% of the nation's farmland, and a lot of that farmland is being used to grow the cash crops, which you don't eat. You don't want to eat cotton or tobacco. Southern soldiers often lacked food. Even so, the citizens struggled to get the kinds of food that they need. Southern cities often had bread riots where people were fighting over whatever available food there was. Okay, so this is kind of a big negative for the South. In terms of iron and steel production, the North produced 93% of the nation's iron and steel. That's going to give you access to a lot of the stuff that you need to make things, for fighting a war, like ammunition and guns and cannons and cannonballs. Whereas the South only had access to produced 7% of the nation's iron and steel. So that's going to be tough for them. The North had larger cities with more factories. They also had access to more workers to make weapons, ammunition, uniforms, etc. They were able to produce 5,000 rifles a day. Compared to the South, they had few factories and workers. They were more of an agrarian-based society. Their soldiers often lacked clothing and supplies. Remember, most of the textile factories and mills are up in the North. Okay. So they've got a lot of cotton laying around, but they don't have the factories to turn it into cloth and to clothe their soldiers. They produce about 300 rifles a day. Railroad mileage. The North had been building railroads to connect their cities for a few years now, and they had an elaborate railroad system that could move soldiers and supplies wherever needed. The South didn't want to invest in a lot of money in building railroads. They had been, to transport things, they had been using the wide flat rivers that they had access to, and each of those plantations mainly had access to a port or a dock where they could load goods and stuff that were going to be bought and sold. So they didn't feel the need to build a whole lot of railroad mileage, which means that they only have access to 28% of the nation's railroads. It's going to become problematic when they want to more efficiently move soldiers and troops and supplies from one place to another as they fight the war. Okay, the economy of the North still has the U.S. banking system. They controlled 70% of the nation's wealth. And during this time, President Abraham Lincoln issues an income tax for the first time to raise more money to pay for the war. An income tax is a tax on the money that an individual makes in a year. So this was supposed to be temporary, and it ended after the war was over. It's something that still exists today, though, for Americans. The more you make, the more the government takes from you. Okay. And for the South, they controlled 30% of the nation's economy. Some of the states resisted taxation when Jefferson Davis was trying to collect taxes to help fund this war. He struggled to get their cooperation. Many of them refused to pay taxes. Remember, they're kind of a rebellious group here. So what he ends up doing is he ends up printing more paper money, which ultimately creates inflation. And we talked about inflation happening when you print more money than you actually have in actual wealth in your country. You have to actually have the wealth to back that up. So we talked about it and compared it to having a large pizza, and the more you cut slices of that pizza, it's like that's like printing more paper money. So, you know, if you have a large pizza and you cut it into 8 pieces versus 10 pieces, you know, it takes fewer pieces to feel full because those pieces are larger. But every time you keep cutting into that and you don't actually add more pizza, you're going to have smaller and smaller slices. So that's kind of the way that inflation works. Okay, the more paper money you print, the less value each of those dollar bills actually represents. All right. The North had access to the established United States Navy, and they used the naval plan called the Anaconda Plan. And you can kind of see in the background this snake and the blockade surrounding the South. And there, you know, an anaconda is a snake it's huge, and it like surrounds, and it kind of strangles its enemy or its prey. So that was kind of the analogy that the North was using with their Anaconda Plan. They're going to strangle the South, keep them from being able to trade and get new things, new supplies and other things, food and weapons into the South. The South had very few warships. They did have a couple. They struggled. Sometimes they could sneak around the blockade. It was really a difficult thing. And in the game that we played today, we often saw in most of the class periods, kids starting to outsmart the naval blockade that we had. They would just go the long way around to avoid them. And that often happened as well with the South. Okay, the Army. The North had few experienced officers. Most soldiers were those Yankee city boys, and they lacked the same kind of training that the Southern Army had. Okay. The South had the most skilled officers. We talked about General Lee leaving the U.S. Army and going to remain loyal to his home state of Virginia. Many of the most skilled officers that had been in the United States Army left the U.S. to join the Confederate Army because that's where they were from. Okay, many of the soldiers for the South were more used to riding horses and shooting guns. This was kind of part of their daily life before, so it didn't take as much training. And that's going to be a big advantage for them. All right, and the knowledge of the land is the last category. Most of the battles of the Civil War are fought in the South, so the northern troops were not as familiar with the land. On the other hand, the Southern troops knew the land well. They were able to fight to defend their homes, which is going to take a lot more, it's going to inspire a lot more feistiness in those Southern troops because they have a lot more riding on the line here. There's a lot more to lose. And, you know, you're fighting to protect your your farm and your family and your home and your whole way of life. And so that, I think, ends up really pushing the South and making this war a whole lot more difficult than it really could have been. If we're just looking at total point value, it would be obvious that the North should have had a major advantage, and in some ways they did, but we can't just go by basic numbers. What we have to keep in mind is the tenacity, the determination. The South is not going to give up easily. They have more to lose. They're fighting to protect their home and their families and their whole way of life. And so it's not going to be some short 90-day war as they had originally anticipated. And we will look more closely at many of the battles, at 10 of the major battles of the Civil War coming up soon. So stay tuned, and thanks for tuning in.